Well, good afternoon and happy Wednesday, everyone. My name is Colleen Connolly, and I am the head of member services for Agency IQ here at Politico. It's so nice to be with you today, and thank you so much for joining us. For those who have been with us since the beginning, welcome back. It's wonderful to be with you again this year. For those who are not familiar, just to provide a little bit of context for what you are seeing today. Politico launched Agency IQ in January of 2020 after studying and identifying a need for greater insight into the FDA. We developed Agency IQ in response to subscriber feedback. We had many conversations with Politico readers who asked us for deeper insight into what was happening within the regulatory space, specifically at the FDA. We spent the better part of 2 years doing market research across 2018 and 2019, speaking with countless regulatory affairs professionals across the US and around the globe to truly understand how we could fill the insight gap that existed. And from those conversations, and with the help of key advisors from the industry as well as former FDA officials, we formed Agency IQ, which is a regulatory intelligence service aiming to simplify, monitor, and provide impactful and insightful analysis on the FDA to regulatory affairs professionals in the life sciences industry. We're thrilled to have Alec Gaffney at the helm of what we do here at Agency IQ, so I will pass the reins to him in just a moment. We have grown our subscriber base exponentially across the past 13 months and are hopeful to expand even more. So if you are interested in learning more about Agency IQ and exploring subscription options, you'll find my email at the bottom of each slide and also at the end of the presentation. And myself or someone from my team can touch base with you directly. So with that, I'll hand it over to Alec to take it from here.
Fantastic. Well, Colleen, thanks so much for introducing me, and thank you to all of you for being on this webinar today. We've got a great presentation for you today. I know I may be a little bit biased since I helped put it together, but we're going to be covering a few things, and four in particular. One, what is the FDA, how is it faring rather under the Biden administration? Second, what are some of the things that we're expecting to have happen in 2021? Third, what is the FDA doing in response to COVID, and how is that evolving over time? And then fourth, we're going to spend some time answering your questions. So as you have them throughout the presentation today, please don't be shy, submit those, and we'll try and answer them either in real time or we'll leave time at the end of the presentation. And of course, if we don't get to them, we will be sure to follow up with all of you by email so you can get those questions answered. So without further ado, let's get started. One of the questions we hear most often is, how is the FDA faring under the Biden administration? Kind of what's happening? What are some of the policies that are at play right now? And what are some of the things that we should be looking out for? I think in the short term, at least, we haven't seen a whole lot. We've actually seen a regulatory freeze that was enacted by Joe Biden, and in particular by his chief of staff, Ron Klain, on the first day of his administration on January 20th. That's not surprising. Any new administration, in particular, when you have one that's transitioning from, let's say, a Republican to a Democrat or vice versa, people, want to know what's coming out of their agencies. Policies take a long time to develop. And one of the things that Joe Biden has seen fit to do is say, well, let's put a pause on things. Let's review all the guidance documents, all the regulations, and let's make sure that we're comfortable with what's coming out. And I think that's all the more important given the sort of adversarial nature between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Not a lot of trust there. There was somewhat of a rocky transition between the two of them. So we're starting to see some signs that regulatory freeze is starting to thaw within the Federal Register. In the past few days, we've started to see many more documents start to be released. But as of yet, we haven't seen any new guidance documents released by the Biden administration, no new regulations, or at least as they pertain to the FDA. We're likely to start seeing that thaw lift perhaps in the next week or two and start seeing things come out. As a result of that, there is a little bit of a backlog at the FDA right now. Now, there are some other factors that may slow the release of guidance in the early days of the Biden administration. One is obviously there are significant resource constraints that exist right now due to COVID. The FDA is very much focused on new therapeutics, new vaccines, new diagnostics, and new devices, and new policies, of course, to help fight COVID. If it's focused on that, it's not able to focus on some of its normal routine actions and guidances and policies. So that may slow things, especially in the first few months. There also may be a backlog of guidance that was not able to be published in 2020. And we know by looking at the guidance agenda documents that are published by the FDA's various medical product centers, including CDER, which regulates drugs, CBER, which regulates biologics, and CDRH, which regulates devices, that there were a lot of documents that were planned for 2020 that just never made their way out. And we're still expecting a lot of those to come out, but it may be at the expense of other newer things. And of course, the FDA is still working to either publish for the first time guidance documents related to COVID-19, but also on the other side, we know that they're often updating these guidance documents and in some cases may see fit to rescind them entirely. So all of these are some things to keep an eye on, at least in the early days of the administration. Moving forward, though, we've spoken about this in past webinars. I think it still holds true, though. There's a sense of consistency across administrations when they come into office as it relates to the FDA. The FDA is perhaps not like the EPA or some other agencies where a new leader means that everything changes, that the direction of policy just absolutely takes a 180, and where before something was focused on clean energy, now it's all about clean coal. FDA tends to be relatively consistent. Now, there are absolutely some things which wind up changing administration to administration, but I think at a high level, things like even greater access to generic drugs, for example, that's a bipartisan issue. A lot of the FDA's approvals tend to be bipartisan issues. Things around efficiency or helping to accelerate the development and approval of new oncology drugs, that's very consistent. So I'm not expecting to see a whole bunch of changes. And to date, we haven't seen any indications from the Biden administration that there are going to be major changes. What we have seen so far are executive orders, including one that rescinded some policies over at the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which had made it more difficult for the FDA to release certain types of guidance documents, and including those that are deemed to be quote unquote significant guidance, or requiring that for every one regulatory action released, that two others be rescinded, that so-called 2-for-1 executive order. Those have been rescinded, and therefore it's going to be a little bit easier for the FDA to do stuff moving ahead. Now, there are other factors that may accelerate guidance as well. There is, as I said, a lack of OIRA review could allow the FDA to publish some guidance documents more quickly. And a great example of that, and we'll talk about this more later, is one guidance document on CBD, on cannabidiol, which had been kind of stuck at OMB and OIRA for much of the last, I think, 6 months or so. OIRA a few weeks ago actually said, you know what, we're withdrawing our review, we're sending that back to the FDA. The FDA could, if it wanted, release that as soon as that regulatory freeze is up, although it's not clear if it may do so. One factor, which again may have certain effects to either slow things down or speed things up, is the FDA is under acting leadership right now. And sometimes acting leaders don't want to rock the boat too much, especially if they're seeking a full nomination. Finally, another factor which may accelerate things is the fact that there may be some guidance documents that were kind of warehoused, so to speak, within the FDA during the Trump administration. No secret that some Trump officials were not keen on releasing a high volume of guidance or regulations. That may mean that there were certain good ideas for guidance documents that may have been proposed, but kind of put on ice. It's possible that those may reemerge now that we have perhaps a more regulatory friendly administration in office. Now, shifting gears, the second, or perhaps in some cases even first most common question we get is, who do you think is going to lead the FDA? I think it's no secret that we've really seen two names emerge time and time again in terms of names that seem most likely, and certainly it's possible that there may be a dark horse candidate that emerges to compete with either of these two. I don't want to say that this list is exhaustive and it can only be these two, but these are the names we keep hearing again and again. For anyone who's followed the FDA for a while, the name Janet Woodcock is going to be extremely familiar. She's been the head of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, for much of the last few decades. She's been at the FDA for about 35 years or so. She is about as experienced an FDA operator as you could possibly imagine. She is very much the establishment candidate. Also started her career at CBER. She has a ton of strengths that would make her very good for this role in the eyes of most kind of objective observers. That length of experience is great. She knows how the levers of regulatory power in the agency work. She's familiar with all the key players, and in particular, the ones that are there now. She's also had experience with COVID-19, and including heading Operation Warp Speed's therapeutic programs for the last year or so. So extremely good on that front. However, the same things which make her strong can also potentially imperil her chances of being nominated for the job. That same experience, 35 years of leadership at FDA, means that she has overseen some decisions which could be seen as maybe not having been made correctly. And two have really come up time and time again. One is related to her oversight of the opioid crisis, and did she act with too much deference toward the approval of certain opioid products? Did she act too slowly to enact things like risk evaluation mitigation strategies or other efforts to curtail the marketing of these products? The other is her decision to overrule FDA line staff at the Office of New Drugs, including OND Director Peter Stein, to facilitate the approval of a drug for Duchenne muscular dystrophy called eteplirsen, or Exondys 51. Critics of Woodcock have pointed to these as being, well, we have a FDA leader here who is too much of kind of old experience. We need some new leadership in here. And they point over to Josh Sharfstein, a employee of some renown, who has previously served at the FDA as, I believe, the #2 under Margaret Hamburg around 2010, 2011, was instrumental in some efforts to reform the way that medical devices are reviewed and the transparency with which they're reviewed. After FDA, served as public health commissioner in Baltimore and is now at Johns Hopkins University. Has some FDA experience, has a lot of public health experience, and has certainly written about the FDA quite a lot. He's kind of positioned himself as the outsider reform candidate at the FDA. In terms of weaknesses here, has sometimes been seen as having a bit of an adversarial relationship with the FDA and with industry, and a relative lack of experience. However, the fact that he's kind of positioned himself on the right side of some of the same issues that are now plaguing Janet Woodcock, at least in kind of nomination rumor mill circles, may act in his favor. So at the end of the day, it's going to be interesting to see maybe who Joe Biden decides to go with here. As we've talked about in prior webinars, Joe Biden likes people that he's familiar with. He likes people that have a lot of experience and a long track record that may work very well in favor of Janet Woodcock, given her kind of length of tenure and experience with the Biden administration. On the point of transparency and kind of reforms, though, something I was given a lot of thought to this week. It's very difficult for there to be kind of a reform-minded FDA commissioner candidate. And this is due to a few things. The most important of which I think is the FDA is not just about a single individual at the top. They are driven and kind of directed to take certain actions by key stakeholders. Of course, the White House is one of them, and Joe Biden has made kind of a big push as of late into indicating that cancer and cancer treatments and development of therapies and the rapid approval of them is going to be one of the things that he really tries to have as his legacy. There's also Congress, which has for years been pushing the FDA to approve things more quickly and using expedited programs. We saw that in the FDA Safety and Innovation Act in 2012, which established the breakthrough therapy designation. We saw that in 2017 and 2016 with the FDA Reauthorization Act and the 21st Century Cures Act, respectively. Congress is constantly pushing the FDA to do things faster and more quickly. Patient groups and industry are certainly along that same vein as well. That makes it difficult for any one individual to come in and say, well, let's pump the brakes. Let's really reevaluate how fast we're approving some of these things. Even though that may be a good idea in some cases, it also means that they're going to be up against stiff political headwinds and may find it very difficult to get nominated in the first place, or even if they do reach that position, they may find it very difficult to kind of take the actions that they want to do. So in the short term, though, kind of wrapping up our Joe Biden, like what is it meant for the new administration? There are a couple short-term issues that are really challenging for the FDA so far that they're going to need to deal with, in the short term, as in like the next 2 to 3 months or so. One of those is backlogs. And we've been talking about this for a while, but especially with the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, pardon me, something that's come up a lot is the FDA just does not have the resources internally to deal with the crush of new product applications, and in particular for emergency use authorization that they've been trying to get past for quite a while now. And within the Office of In Vitro Diagnostic Products, led by Director Tim Stenzel, they've been talking about the need where they have a surge of products where they've been trying to bring in as much staff from the rest of CDRH as possible to deal with this surge. However, that means that they're pulling staff off of other kind of non-emergent products, which means that they now have an issue with, well, everything else is slowing down. So what winds up happening here is you have a surge in one direction, then the FDA is likely to have a surge in the other direction to kind of ameliorate some of the effects caused by the first surge. And then a lot of these products that were initially granted EUAs may need to be updated as well. It's leading to a very difficult situation in which I think a lot of companies have already started telling us they're facing delays, they're facing development challenges. And one of the things where, like, if something's got to give, early stage development meetings are the thing that FDA is saying, we just don't have time to do this anymore. That's going to have a lot of downstream effects as companies just don't have the best advice that they need to address some of these things. Laura DiAngelo is one of our in-house experts on medical device and diagnostic regulation. Laura, let me ask you, there have been some things recently on diagnostic regulation policy in the waning days of the Trump administration. What's going on there, and kind of what are you looking for?
Right, so this is also a pretty pressing, timely issue. On the way out the door, the previous Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health in HHS, Brett Giroir, had a little bit of a disagreement with the leadership of the FDA simply on the trajectory by which a certain kind of diagnostic or laboratory developed test should be regulated. There was a bit of back and forth that led to quite a bit of regulatory uncertainty for both clinical laboratories and diagnostic manufacturers who have clinical laboratory business units. And on the way out the door, there was a contract signed with life sciences management consulting company NDA Partners, which is quite stacked with former FDA Device Center professionals, including the person who directly preceded Tim Stenzel as the director of in vitro diagnostics. And there is a contract there that will last through, we'll talk about it certainly later, through summer 2021. There is also some outstanding questions about authorizations that were taken directly by OASH, the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. 3 were announced, 2 are now listed in the IVD EUA database. And as of exactly 1 week ago, on a call with industry, Tim Stenzel, the director of in vitro diagnostics, did indicate that those discussions about what exactly will be done with those diagnostics, what is exactly going to be done as the path forward, and what's going to be done with the ones who are already authorized is still a conversation with HHS. So that is an issue that still needs to be addressed at regulatory levels.
And speaking of kind of those waning days of the Trump administration, scandals and things that need to be dealt with, I think that's a great segue into the OTC user fee problem, because in January of 2021, there was a bit of a brouhaha kind of emerging over the holidays where distillers were furious at the FDA for what they perceived to be kind of the FDA throwing them under the bus. The 30-second version here is early on in the pandemic, there were shortages of hand sanitizer, and the FDA said, you know what, in the interest of increasing the supplies of this, let's allow distillers or other non-traditional drug manufacturers to come in, make hand sanitizer. And as long as they register with us, we'll be fine with that because we want to be able to track who's making it and inspect them if necessary. Now, unbeknownst to them, about 3 days after FDA made that decision, Congress came out and said, actually, we just surprised, we passed this new user fee legislation covering over-the-counter products. And one of the factors associated with that law was for any registered OTC user fee facility, a maker of OTC drugs, of which hand sanitizer is one, they would need to pay an annual registration fee. So all of a sudden, FDA's policy to require these companies to register rendered them an OTC manufacturer. So when FDA sent out its automated, hi, thanks for registering, please pay a fee for next year, these distilleries wound up getting hit with one of these user fees. Now, HHS and the White House kind of furious about this. Instead of saying, let's carve out distilleries, told the FDA, you need to rescind this entire order for all user fees. And to this date, FDA still has not been able to collect user fees from industry. Now, that's problematic in both the short term and long term because it means that the FDA cannot start enacting some badly needed reforms in the OTC sector until it has the money to actually start hiring staff and developing policy and make other things. But I think these three things all together are difficult topics to deal with. The FDA is really going to be grappling with these for quite a while. For the OTC thing, because there are legal challenges associated with that, with diagnostic regulation because of the political implications and the fact that there is a contract signed, with the backlogs because FDA and Jeff Shuren and Tim Stenzel can't just snap their fingers and have 200 extra trained regulatory staff who know how to deal with diagnostics. So all things to watch. Now, shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about what we're looking for the FDA to do in 2021. We've talked about some of these things before in the past with respect to our FDA forecast, and we do hope that those of you who have access to that are able to see a few key and recurring themes here. But we're going to break this down into various product sectors. And first, let's talk about pharmaceutical projects and projections that we're looking at. One of the key challenges that the FDA has been facing in the last year is the fact that it has been, in some cases, unable to, or in other cases, just doesn't want to subject its staff to the dangers of inspecting pharmaceutical facilities, and in particular ones that are based internationally. And as a result, one of its core functions, that is inspecting where drugs are made to ensure that they're being made properly, has just been unable to occur. And as a result of that, there's been a shortage of inspections. What we're thinking, though, is that the FDA has been laying the groundwork for many, many, many years now to require requests from companies that they send along what are known as drug quality metrics. That is data about the state of manufacturing quality in their facilities. What sort of lot release data do you have? Are there lots that are being rejected? Are there out of specification results? Things like that. What FDA may require is that, or ask, is that companies submit voluntarily that data to the FDA. And in return, any company that voluntarily submits it and is also seen as having good quality levels may be moved to like the back of the line in terms of prioritization, whereas other companies that are not willing to send along that may be put to the front of the line and face very rapid inspections thereafter. Speculation on our part, but we think this is one of the things that FDA is most likely to do. The second thing is a continued focus on real-world evidence. And for anyone who's on the call and not aware, real-world evidence refers to data that is obtained from kind of the real-world use of a product. Data that's obtained from electronic health records, from insurance claims forms, from patient registries, from all sorts of data that you might find just kind of out in the wild, outside of a clinical trial, in other words. FDA has said in its guidance agenda that it's planning on releasing at least 3 guidance documents related to the use of RWE this year alone. One on the use of registries, another on the use of electronic health records, and another on how RWE can be used to support regulatory decision-making. Now, certainly the FDA isn't the only entity that's focused on this. Congress, in particular, through the 21st Century Cures Act and potentially through subsequent legislation, has been extremely focused on this issue, and we're expecting this to be something that the FDA grapples with for quite a long time to come. Finally, shifting away from the branded space into the complex generic space, FDA has been really again, grappling with this issue of how does it regulate generic products that have complex formulations. And by a complex formulation or a complex generic, I mean products that have difficult to manufacture forms. Maybe they have a device component. Maybe they have delayed release formulations. When you're thinking about making a generic version of a branded pharmaceutical product, the more difficult the original product is, the more factors are at play and can really make it challenging to determine, is this product truly generic to an original one? So for example, if you had, let's say, an albuterol type inhaler, FDA might be interested in the effect of the device on the dispersion of the aerosol droplets from that device and whether or not that results in the same amount of the drug reaching the same amount of the site of action in receptors in the lungs, things like that. FDA has been talking about for a few years now that it's really focused in on this area with new product specific guidances. It's a lot more difficult though, and the FDA really needs to go sometimes product by product to develop essentially plans for companies to say, these are the studies you need to run to get this product onto the market. And unfortunately, for at least taxpayers, those complex generics tend to be among the products that are most expensive on the market, outside of biologics, of course, and are the most resilient to generic competition and winds up costing CMS and Medicare and Medicaid quite a lot of money long term. So shifting gears a little bit, let me bring Laura DiAngelo back in to talk about two things, medical devices, and then on the next slide, diagnostics. Laura?
Sure thing. Thanks, Alec. So from our perspective, and I think from a broad industry and scientific perspective, 2021, we're expecting a lot of things out of the Digital Health Center of Excellence. The COVID-19 pandemic has obviously forced a lot of the furnish and provision of clinical practice into digital spaces and socially distanced practice of medicine. That has led to, while digital health has been a hot topic for several years, has kind of expedited the timeline for the use case of these technologies. So the Digital Health Center of Excellence, which is housed within the FDA's Device Center, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, was formally stood up at the end of last year. It's expected to really kind of hit the ground running this year. But a lot of the work that we're expecting out of the DHCOE this particular year is kind of behind the scenes work. We're looking at the agency building out its own team. They need to hire and train up quite a few people for this particular segment of CDRH. They also are working on building out their own regulatory understanding of things like the bias that exists in artificial intelligence algorithms, setting standards and definitions of new and emerging technologies, recognizing standards organizations that maybe are untraditional from the medical device side, and really building out those relationships and figuring out where, once again, the Digital Health Center of Excellence will live within CDRH, but is intended to provide kind of support on an agency-wide level. So building out those operational working relationships. But we are expecting at least one guidance from the Digital Health Center of Excellence by the end of this year, which will be draft guidance on pre-specified change plans for software as a medical device, or a kind of streamlined pathway for making pre-market assumptions about the way that a software device will need to be updated or may change over time when it is already in the market. And that's something that we've actually already seen in some approval and de novo granting. So a formalized pathway forward for that. Something else we're expecting out of CDRH for this year is a lot of regulatory updates based on the pilots and programs that they've worked to stand up in previous years. So this is the first full year that we have the safety and performance-based pathway up and running and guidance finalized to get more devices to market with reliance on standards rather than predicates, which has kind of been a large long-term priority for both Congress and the FDA as a modernization of the device pathways. The ASCA pilot, or the accreditation scheme for conformity assessments, which kind of takes some work off of the plates of FDA reviewers themselves by allowing for some third-party laboratory testing and accreditation, which certainly has a use case here in the COVID world. And something that we personally and definitely industry is very excited is the stand-up of the Safer Technologies, or STEP program, which is a new designation based off the breakthrough device designation, but for a different set of medical devices to kind of open that up. However, as Alec mentioned earlier, The STEP program is potentially going to be delayed, given that it's a brand new program. They were working on standing it up when the administration changed hands, and according to a fairly recent call, the STEP program might be facing some residual delays as the new administration needs to kind of check out what they're doing, see how that's going, and that could a little bit delay the actual standing up. Something that, again, Alec had previously mentioned, but that is something that we are certainly keeping an eye on, is CDRH has a significant backlog of Q submission, pre-submission, early in development meeting requests, submissions that have been backburnered while the Office of the In Vitro Diagnostics and Radiological Health, also known as OHT7, but I will call it the Office of In Vitro Diagnostics, kind of faces a flood. They have basically doubled their workload in this year, which has led to all of pretty much the microbiology staff having been drawn into EUAs for COVID diagnostics. That is a backlog that will need to be addressed. It does look like they're going to work on a triage-based priority system. So the largest public health benefit will kind of get first dibs rather than first in, first out. And then the final thing that we're certainly looking for here is a continued focus on breakthrough device designations on the way out. The previous Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services leadership did finalize a rule called Medicare Coverage for Innovative Technologies, which creates a brand new pathway to coverage for products that have been designated as a breakthrough device by the FDA. No word yet on whether that extends to the STEP program, which once again has not yet been fully implemented. But considering there's some high-level concerns about the MCIT rule as it stands, including from the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission. So the future of the MCIT in the hands of a new Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is kind of up in the air at this point. And then revisiting 2020 is likely to be a huge part of CDRH's role going forward, in that a lot of what it had planned to do based on its guidance agenda, as Alec was mentioning, and based on kind of the priorities that it had set out for the year, which did have to get a little bit tabled. The biggest and most highly anticipated one that we're watching obviously very closely, is the transition from the FDA's QSR medical device regulations to the International Harmonized Data Quality Standard, ISO 13485, which is a transition that we have been waiting. And then moving quickly to diagnostics, our diagnostics issue is certainly an interesting one, and it's definitely something that will again be highlighted in 2021. Stepping forward into a kind of emerging issue is the viral variants associated with the SARS virus. The FDA's work on validation for molecular diagnostics is underway. Moving forward, it looks like there might be some increased emphasis on multi-target assays, so molecular diagnostics that don't just look at one specific gene, but are able to kind of sequence on a more comprehensive basis. So that way there's less likelihood that they're going to be faced with incomplete information in the face of a viral variant. The pathway forward for different kinds of diagnostics is kind of up in the air at this particular point. There was a conversation that CDC might step in with some sort of validation support. But in previous weeks, the Office of In Vitro Diagnostics Director, Tim Stenzel, had indicated that maybe the CDC at this point was at capacity, and that the agency is now looking for different federal partners to kind of be involved. We do know, as Politico reported, CDC is now going to be working on a large-scale genomic sequencing project that will likely inform this at the FDA level going forward. As we briefly talked about, the HHS FDA LDT policies do remain up in the air, but it is something that will need to get resolved. As of now, we're not exactly sure how. We do know that those conversations are ongoing. HHS does have a contract outstanding with a third-party entity that would be providing basically third-party reviews of certain laboratory-developed tests. How that contract will be used remains to be seen. There is a potential extension for that contract into October 2021. There's limited clarity, but we do know that there has been a long-standing push, and it has been in previous years a bipartisan understanding that diagnostic policy reform, and especially the role of LDTs in the diagnostic market, is something that is being revisited. So the most recent iteration of that legislative push to reform diagnostic regulation is called the VALID Act. It was it was most recently introduced in the 116th Congress. We are now in the 117th, and we did get a question in the chat. We are expecting it to be reintroduced. The public date that we have is around April, but I do know that legislator offices are working to get it out a little earlier than that. So that is something that we can expect in the next 2-ish months. And then finally and quickly, an emerging issue that we're facing and is certainly kind of rolling faster every week is the advent of the availability of non-laboratory diagnostics and how exactly public health reporting is going to be maintained in a situation in which diagnostics are not being run in laboratories that have the reporting mechanisms. So it's kind of on manufacturers and developers at this point, although EUA authorization doesn't require a reporting strategy. So it's being invented as we speak. HHS is the entity that maintains standards for what needs to be reported. Those include things like the unique device identifier, or UDI. However, that also is not required as part of an EUA. So there is a lot of concern that there are going to be data breaks, which lead to public health reporting issues, which can lead to surveillance issues.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Laura. Shifting now over to the biologics projections that we have. There are a few things here, and I'm also going to bring in my colleague Kedest Tadesse, who's one of our biologics experts here. But to start off talking about interchangeables, 2020 was a massive year for biologics regulation. And unless you're kind of aware of some of the intricacies of the 2010 Affordable Care Act, you probably missed some of this. When the ACA was passed in 2010, FDA was given a 10-year period to transition any product that was originally approved as a drug, but was actually a biologic, to the biologics pathway, or what's known as a biologics license application, or BLA. Now, there were about 100 or so products to which this applied, but many of the ones that were affected were insulin products. These are relatively simple biologics that have been on the market for quite a long time. And while there weren't necessarily all that many like generic products, there were many products, pardon me, that were approved under what's called the 505(b)(2) pathway, which is a very similar, conceptually similar to a generic, but with some minor differences. What we're expecting to have happen in 2020 is probably at least one of these products will probably seek licensure as a interchangeable biosimilar product. Now, there are two standards of kind of biosimilarity, which is kind of conceptually similar to a generic to a brand product. These are products that are very similar. However, because a protein-based biologic, basically impossible to exactly replicate it, many of them are instead held to a different standard called biosimilarity, where there can be some minor differences, but as long as the effects of that product are generally the same, the FDA will approve it using somewhat less evidence. Interchangeability, though, is a much higher level of standard, essentially that there are no distinguishing differences between the original biologic and the new interchangeable biologic. To date, the FDA has not approved a single interchangeable product. So to the extent that we see that this year, we're also expecting to see a good number of guidance and new policies developed and released kind of corresponding to that, because when the FDA needs to do something for the first time, they need to develop the policies to do that in a sustainable, replicable way moving forward. Speaking of the ACA, rather, we're also expecting the Supreme Court of the US to weigh in on the constitutionality again of the ACA. Some of you probably remember, or if you didn't, my prior segment talking about this, the ACA established the pathway for biosimilars to be approved. Therefore, if the entire law is thrown out, as it could conceivably have happened, the FDA's biosimilars pathway as well would also be thrown out. Now, that would offer a few different, let's say, opportunities for Congress to move forward. They could simply just reconstitute the entire thing as it was written, or they may seek to make some additional improvements to that as a condition of passing it again. Either way, I think this is a unlikely scenario, but it's still one that we're looking at. Bringing in Kedest here, there's been a lot of talk about FDA and cell and gene therapies. Kedest, what are some of the things that you're looking for this year?
Thanks, Alec. Well, we've seen CBER publishing several final guidance documents in 2020, laying the groundwork for this year, 2021. The updated CBER guidance agenda towards the end of last year added a few new guidance documents to the list where some were published in 2020, such as the guidance on manufacturing considerations for approved and investigational cell and gene therapies during this pandemic. But we're still waiting for some more, which have now been included in the 2021 CBER guidance agenda, such as the one on considerations for the development of CAR T therapies, another one on human gene therapies that incorporate genome editing. And we've seen a new guidance also. We are about to see a new guidance on studying multiple versions of a cellular and gene therapy product, which I believe was a request from industry. In addition to guidance documents, the PDUFA negotiations have been ongoing. There have been ideas floated between industry and agency meetings on policy improvement, additional guidance documents, but the major challenge for the division and by default for sponsors has been staffing. According to Wilson Bryan, Director of Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies, or OTAT, there have been more than 800 and 1,000 active cell therapy and gene therapy INDs in the last year. And the FDA had planned to hire about 50 clinical reviewers in the year 2019, which for obvious reasons has not been fulfilled. So the staff shortage has been really difficult for the division, in addition to the influx of COVID-19 application, where OTAT reviewers have also been reassigned to review these applications. So it's likely somewhat going to be a less responsive division in 2021, even if we will see guidance documents. So sponsor interactions and submissions could face some delays.
Thanks, Kedest. Well said. And to wrap up our kind of view of what else we're looking at, I think the big thing that we're expecting within the dietary supplement space, or at least kind of a pseudo dietary supplement, is action on CBD or cannabidiol. We talked a little bit earlier in this presentation about how the FDA had a guidance document called an enforcement discretion guidance that was under review at the Office of Management and Budget in OIRA since July of 2020. It was recently released back to the FDA, and it could conceivably come out with that at any time. While it's unclear exactly what's in that guidance document, what we're expecting is that the FDA is essentially going to allow certain types of CBD products to be marketed within kind of narrow considerations. So if it is a well-characterized product, if it is held to certain quality standards, that's the sort of thing that we're expecting to maybe be allowed to be marketed more easily. On the other hand, are you going to see like vapable CBD products on the market? Absolutely not. Anything where the FDA has consistently said we have health-related concerns with this product and its presentation, or where it may be difficult for a person to know the exact dosage of what they're getting, let's say like an edible product containing CBD, very unlikely for the FDA to allow those to come out to market. However, it's also something to watch out for. Is Congress going to want the FDA to go further? We've seen some efforts already in the 117th Congress to make restrictions on the use or sale or manufacture of marijuana-based products to be more lenient. It's possible that Congress will look at FDA's guidance document and say, you know what, that's a good start, but let's go even further. Let's make this, easier for consumers to access as kind of a harm mitigation manner. And that same sort of congressional interaction, I think, goes to a lot of the things that we've been talking about, and in particular, what Laura DiAngelo was mentioning around diagnostics regulation. Finally, and I'm not going to belabor the point, but it's been a huge few months for OTC regulation. In addition to the stuff around distilleries, the FDA in 2021 is expected to establish much of the groundwork around over-the-counter monograph user fees and to try and get its OTC monograph regulatory change regime kind of going so that it's ready to hit the ground running starting in 2022 when a lot of the new user fee provisions start coming into effect. So one other thing, and Kedest mentioned this briefly, PDUFA. In fact, there are many user fee agreements that the FDA and industry are currently looking to renegotiate right now. By PDUFA, we mean the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, MEDUFA, Medical Device User Fee Act, and then GDUFA and BSUFA are for generic drugs and biosimilar drugs, respectively. These programs are instrumental. They basically give the FDA more than half of its funding, and they relate to essentially a bargain. for industry. And I don't mean that in like the, go to Kohl's and get like 20% off kind of way. I mean, a bargain in terms of give something, get something. Industry will give the FDA funding much in the same way that you go to the DMV and you give them money in exchange for a license. Industry will pay the FDA every time that it submits a new product application, or if it registers its facilities on an annual basis. In return for that funding, the FDA will take that, it'll hire additional staff, it'll make process improvements. And in theory, that allows the FDA to be more efficient and review applications more quickly and consistently, which helps industry because it means that it gets more usable time out of its patented products. These programs are up for renewal every 5 years, and some other user fee programs are on a different 5-year reauthorization cycle. But PDUFA has been in effect since 1992, MDUFA since, I believe, 1997, and GDUFA and BsUFA since 2012. This is clearly not the first time that they've been in existence, not even the first time they've been reauthorized. As a result of that, the changes to the program are becoming smaller and more targeted, more specific as time has gone on. What we've heard so far out of the PDUFA negotiations, for example, is FDA really wants to focus on cell and gene therapies, get more authority to hire staff, more guidance out on certain topics in particular, like real world evidence. For MDUFA, there's been a lot of talk about how does CDRH adapt to what it's learned from the pandemic. For GDUFA, a lot of talk about how to improve first cycle approvals. And for BsUFA, more timely, effective early stage meetings being seen as being especially helpful. This is going to kind of overshadow every other policy development this year, where FDA is clearly moving toward some larger systemic changes that are going to be happening in the background, but it's unlikely that any of these things actually happen until 2022 at the very earliest, and more than likely 2023 to 2024. So shifting gears, and I am aware we are, we've got about 13 minutes left. So as you do have questions, please submit them. I'm going to try and kind of fly through this next section so that we do have time to answer those questions. These slides will be available after. If you want to email Colleen Connolly, whose email address is at the bottom here, she'll be happy to make these slides available to you. So in terms of COVID-19, what are some of the things that we're looking for? If you've been in our webinars in the past, we've talked about this issue at extraordinary length. I don't want to kind of revisit too many of the things that we've talked about before, but one thing that we haven't talked about before is just workforce disruption. This is something that I don't believe many people are talking about, but is probably one of the key issues for the FDA. Its workforce has been working flat out, extremely hard for an entire year now. There are a lot of people that are just getting burnt out. They're working 6-7 days a week with no breaks in sight. And it's very taxing on people to be kind of in that position where they know if they're not showing up with their A game every day, that people aren't going to get the therapies they need or the diagnostics they need to effectively treat the pandemic or respond to the pandemic. As staff maybe get burnt out or leave the agency, it's then very difficult to replace them because one, it just takes a really long time for the FDA to hire new staff. But in addition to that, it takes a really long time to train them up to the level of competency that they need to. And if you're going from 0 to pandemic speed, that's just all the more challenging. And there are fewer staff to kind of help bring you up to speed at the same time because they're already busy. We're also looking at a potential wave of retirements. I think there was a report out from, I'm forgetting the group now, but a few years ago, and that found that about a quarter of the FDA's senior leadership is at an age where they're eligible to retire. That's going to be very difficult for the FDA to start replacing not just line level staff, but highly experienced senior staff who may know, all of the regulatory history behind the way that certain things are happening. And of course, we'll also have new leadership at the top in 2021, whether or not that's Janet Woodcock or another person. There's going to be some changes that are happening there. Any new commissioner typically likes to bring in at least some of their own staff to kind of augment their vision and enact certain changes that they're looking for. There's also, too, I'll note, a lot of open positions in the middle, and by the middle, I mean the middle of FDA, looking, for example, at the Office of New Drugs within the CDER division. I think when I last checked, there was something like more than 50 positions that were either vacant or held on an acting basis at the director or like deputy director level. There's a lot of kind of excess capacity that needs to still be filled. And it's very difficult to bring in senior folks who are able to operate at the level of, say, a Woodcock or a Peter Stein or someone around that director level. Let me bring Kedest back in because there are some things that we're looking for within the next wave of vaccines. You know, we saw Pfizer and Moderna's emergency use authorization and meetings of the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. That's a mouthful. We're just going to call it VRBPAC from now on. But that was kind of an early stage look at some of the issues that FDA is grappling with. Now that we're starting to move ahead, though, we're starting to look at things a little bit differently. Kedest, what are some of the things that are on your mind? How are you assessing some of these upcoming vaccine products?
So when the first and second vaccine advisory committee meetings took place and the FDA actually reviewed the authorization applications, there were no emerging strains, or it was very early that the concern was not discussed during the advisory committee meetings or during the review of the application, as far as we know. So now that these new strains are present and we're aware of it, the big questions are, if it's going to be lowered efficacy from the vaccines to treat this new emerging strains, how low of an effectiveness, or what's acceptable to the agency? How is the FDA going to monitor the effect of these vaccines on these new strains? And if there are cases that the vaccines might not work at all on these new emerging strains.
Yeah, and Kedest, on that note, you know, FDA's original guidance document that they put out earlier
Yep.
this year on the use of EUAs had a very bright line, which was 50% efficacy. We still haven't learned if the FDA may say, you know what, do we apply this on a strain by strain basis that like cumulatively you have more than 50%, but like the South African strain of COVID that's going around, maybe if that's 30%, the scope of your label is going to have to narrow to exclude that. It's something we haven't even talked about.
There are a lot of questions. So let's say the Pfizer vaccine is now at 95%. If it's on the South African, I'm just talking hypothetically right here, it's not all fact. So if it's the 95%, if it's on a new strain, it's 60%, is the agency going to say, we'll take the 60%? It also depends on the number of vaccines available, the doses available. Are we going to change the labeling to certain vaccines that are below a certain threshold? There are a lot of questions, and I think it depends on what we will learn about this new strains in the next few weeks. I think we will see a lot of discussion in the next VRBPAC meeting for J&J, where one, the actual effectiveness is a little lower than what we've seen before, but now that these new and emerging strains are at the forefront of the conversation, there will be more conversations around this. But what we're likely to see is the FDA is definitely going to somehow monitor these and also request sponsors and companies developing these therapies to conduct studies either now or as part of a post-marketing study.
Fantastic. All right. Well, moving on to our last slide here, I think the other thing that we're monitoring is in year one of the pandemic in 2020, the FDA was in kind of panic, do everything as fast as possible, kind of move fast and break things mode. In 2021, it's starting to adapt to a new normal where it knows things, it's used to these things. So we're going to see likely smaller, more targeted new guidance on COVID, lots of updates to some of these guidance documents. Another shift in just kind of what companies are doing. Initially in 2020, lots of focus on let's just get stuff done through the EUA pathway. Increasingly, I think we're going to see a lot more companies saying, well, let me get approved, let me get cleared, let me go through the FDA's de novo process for novel medical devices. That's likely to raise some new regulatory challenges. It may also raise some new regulatory capacity issues for the FDA, because if it just spent a whole bunch of time reviewing something for an EUA and now it needs to re-review that for a full product application, that's a lot of duplication of effort. So let's kind of keep an eye on whether or not FDA adapts to a slightly different stance or a more streamlined approach. Finally, FDA is probably likely to focus on removing some ineffective products from the market. We've seen that already with certain serology-based tests. that were initially on the market without much review. We've seen it too with the FDA filing an import alert on Mexican manufacturers of hand sanitizer, for example. There's likely more to come, especially in the diagnostic space. So let me turn now to some of the questions that we've gotten. And certainly if you have more, please send them our way. We'll do our best to kind of answer them in real time. We received one question in terms of short-term pressing items, and this is going all the way back to the beginning of our presentation, so apologies for that. Near the end of the Trump administration, Secretary Azar ceded all jurisdiction for genetic food animals to USDA in place of the shared authority that the two agencies had negotiated. How quickly will this be re-examined and addressed? That's a good question. While we don't typically focus too much on food-related issues, I think the dynamic that I would look to here is one, when is permanent leadership in place at both HHS and USDA? Right now, the nominee for HHS director, Javier Becerra, is, I believe, likely to probably be confirmed within the next month or two. I'm not entirely sure what the dynamic is at USDA, but at a minimum, because that agreement was signed through a memorandum of understanding, it would probably take senior leaders to kind of undo that or figure out a way to either unwind that or figure out if it's even worth unwinding that. Maybe they come to the same understanding, but with an additional level of comfort between the two agencies. So great question. We received another question. Do you see FDA being open to BLA submissions for COVID-19 vaccines in 2021, even while we currently have 1+ active EUAs? That's a great question and something Kedest and I were actually talking before this webinar about. I believe Pfizer has indicated that it plans to submit what's known as a biologic license application, or BLA, in April of this year. An open question is, how long is the FDA's review of that going to take? Traditionally, a priority review takes about 8 months for the FDA to review. Even when it's doing, let's say, an oncology review for a BLA product, it'll take around 3 or 4 months. It's possible that the FDA may be able to kind of review these BLAs much more quickly. And the reason for that is if you look back to the original guidance document released by the FDA, they essentially called it an EUA plus approach, that almost all parts of that application FDA is already familiar with and comfortable with. It just hasn't kind of gone through the motions of reviewing some of the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls data and other things. So I would expect to see at least one vaccine approved in 2021. Now, the other side of your question, though, is, how does this affect that interaction between an approved product and an emergency use authorized product? Because part of the statutory basis of having a emergency use authorization is that there is no approved version of that product. However, there are also some subparts of that statute which say, in addition to there not being an unapproved product, if an approved product is not available in sufficient quantities, that product is still able to be marketed. So I would expect, at least in the early part of this year, even if there is an approved vaccine or a licensed vaccine, that there are still many EUA granted products available under that exemption. That is, that there are not currently sufficient numbers of vaccines out there to meet market demand. And that kind of dynamic may persist as well as we continue to see variants of COVID kind of lowering some vaccine efficacy and proving resilient others. I think that is all the questions we had, and actually great timing because we are at the end of our time. In terms of final things, certainly if you have any additional questions that you think of after this, my email is right here, and please feel free to email either myself or Laura or Kedest or Colleen. If you are looking to sign up for FDA Today, let's say you had a colleague who forwarded you this webinar, you can go to agencyiq.com and you can sign up for our weekly newsletter. That, I say weekly, it comes out about 4 times every week. So, and then if you have questions about becoming a subscriber to AgencyIQ and you like our insights and think we've got some cool stuff to say, again, please reach out to Colleen Connolly and she can help provide you with additional information and possibly set up a call. So that being said, let's wrap stuff up on time. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Alec Gaffney. Appreciate this. And we will have another one of these webinars in about a month. So certainly if you enjoyed this, we will be in touch for our next one.